It was a constant struggle not to lose my sanity and go mad. It would have been so easy just to let it go. It offered the only escape. And Tariq Shaw, who spent 33 months in solitary, said of the experience, "My situation only seemed to get worse. I would not have minded for the government to save their money and spend it on only one bullet for my head. At least my family's suffering and mine would have been over." There are thousands of prisoners in solitary confinement all over the country. The government wants us to forget these prisoners as if they were buried alive, and also wants us to forget that solitary confinement is a form of torture. The National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms and the Muslim Legal Fund of America are determined that we shall not forget these prisoners, nor the torture that they have endured. And that is why we are inviting the political prisoner in solitary confinement to share tonight's program with us, so that none of us will forget. Thank you.
My name is Samar Harara, and I'm the Regional Director for the Muslim Legal Fund of America's new San Francisco Bay Area office. It's an honor to have you guys all here with us today. Before I say a few words, I wanted to invite one of our board members, Dr. Jessica Nam, to offer a few remarks.
Good evening, everybody, and on behalf of the Board of Directors of the MLFA, our Executive Director, Mr. Khalil Meek, our Regional Director, Samar Harara, it's really an honor and a pleasure to welcome you here tonight. We have a tremendous program. The MLFA is the only organization of its kind in the United States dedicated to funding legal cases for Muslim Americans, intended to protect not only civil liberties, but now constitutional rights. Some of the noteworthy cases that you may know about include the Holy Land Fund, the Irvine 11, Imam Fuad Farahi, and Dr. Amr Musin, among others. And probably within the next few weeks, we're going to be hearing about the Holy Land case, because we have petitioned to the U.S. Supreme Court in terms of our appeal, and we'll be hearing probably by the third week of October about that. We're really delighted to have an awesome group here to be speaking, especially Glenn, welcome, and we're really delighted and honored to have you tonight. And I'm going to start the pitch for the MLFA, and we're a proud coalition member of NCPCF. We really need your support. This is an organization that you can plug into. We now have a regional office, and this is something that we can all come together on and work towards. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the evening tonight.
The Muslim Legal Fund of America just actually opened its San Francisco Bay Area office a few weeks ago. So I'm really excited to help the organization promote its presence here in San Francisco and the Bay Area region. Some of you may know me because I used to work with the Asian Law Caucus for 3 years, working on national security and civil rights issues. Have any of you guys heard of Asian Law Caucus? So for those of you who haven't heard of Asian Law Caucus was actually started to defend Japanese internment victims. And tonight we're here to talk about what's been going on in the United States for the past decade. The assault on civil liberties, the assault on civil rights. And when most people think of that context, they think of the Muslim American community. But if you look at the history of the United States, we also know that these assaults are not new. And they have been happening throughout our history, targeting a number of different communities. And although Muslim Americans may be at the forefront of these attacks in our current time, it's really important for all Americans to be united in defending against these attacks. And we're very excited tonight to have really strong speakers that will help us connect the dots on what's been going on and what we can do together as a community that's concerned about these civil liberties abuses.
All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for all coming out tonight on this gorgeous Dallas evening. But welcome everyone to the inaugural benefit event for the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms, co-sponsored by the Muslim Legal Fund of America. My name is Abdullah Shaki, and I am the Regional Director for the Muslim Legal Fund of America here in Dallas. And so I welcome you all on behalf of both organizations. Thank you for coming. You being here tonight shows that you care about what's going on in this country, you care about the issues at hand, and you care to learn more about how you can support NCPCF, and other organizations in the fight to protect our civil freedoms. To begin our evening, I'm going to invite a man who really needs no introduction, my boss, the Executive Director for the Muslim Legal Fund, Mr. Khalil Meek.
Assalamu alaikum. The universal greeting of Islam, peace and blessings be upon all of you. Thank you for being here tonight. You're in for a treat. Coming tonight, you're going to hear a little bit from me about what's going on in the courtrooms, about the coalition, what we're trying to do. Glenn is going to be able to put it in a perspective that is better than all of us have been able to articulate it amongst ourselves. So you're going to leave here with a very good understanding of what's going on around us. You've been invited here to hear that message, to support two organizations that are really trying to make a difference. And we want all of you to think tonight, if what we are saying resonates, if it makes sense, then we would like to see your support. And tonight, my job is to begin with setting a framework for all of the conversation to follow. The Muslim Legal Fund, we're a charity that helps Muslims face legal challenges. We're not a law firm, we're a legal fund. What we do is we collect money from events like this all over the United States. With the funds we collect, we hire attorneys to defend Muslims so far in the courtroom. It's not necessarily to be Muslims, but we're playing catch up. So right now we're the Muslim Legal Fund and we have more cases than we have funds. So we are not intending to keep it exclusive to Muslims, but that's where we are today. As a charity, we're tax exempt, and our goal is to be a vehicle, a tool for the community to use as a legal fund when we see cases taking place around us that affect either our imams, our leaders, our activists, our organizations, or anybody who has been touched by national security issues after 9/11, when the community feels like it's an unjust prosecution. And we, as a Muslim Legal Fund, don't know who we defend, whether they're innocent or guilty. That's not our role in the matter. But what we've seen is that in response to security, the government is seeking to take away liberties, freedoms, and norms that this country was founded on, so that it thinks it'll balance security with less freedom. And if we agree with that, then that's a new direction for America. If we disagree with that, then we need to talk about it in ways that people can understand why we disagree with it. The Muslim Legal Fund, as an organization, is proud to be an American organization. We're proud Americans serving America. We love the Constitution of this United States. We love due process. We love the rule of law. We love open, transparent government. We love checks and balances. We love the system that was enshrined and built this nation to the legacy that it has. We believe that the people who died for these principles should be honored by us protecting them. And what we're going to go into is not just a conspiracy theory. We're not going to be talking about theories. We're just going to talk about what's going on and whether we like it or we don't like it. Whether we want to do anything about it or we want to accept it. Right now, I want to portray for you the message that we're going to be talking about is what we consider to be unjust prosecutions. We have terms called preemptive prosecution. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about thought crimes. We're going to talk about laws that have been passed that are so broad and vague as to be able to criminalize almost anything. And this is not something that you may read about every day, but it is happening more and more, and you see people that have been affected by this. We encourage all of you after the program, if you have not already, to just take a minute or two and just read a little bit about these cases, see the names here, and then for sure go back on your own, visit our websites, visit the civilfreedoms.org website, and start to catch up on a lot of information that you may have already missed. Starting tonight, let me just share with you the nature of the problem as we see it. Back in 1996, the United States government passed a law called the Omnibus Act. In the Omnibus Act of 1996, there is a statute that's referred to as the Material Support Statute. For those of you who may never have heard that term, I'll give you the definition. It is against the law for any U.S. citizen or resident of the United States to provide material support to a designated terrorist or a terrorist organization. I agree with that law. We have a national security, we have a war on terror. If we want to fight it and we want to be safe, then we need to have means to be effective. I'm not against that. But when we ask people to clarify this term, material support, you can't provide material support, what exactly is material support? Well, when we get into the definition, it says that the definition of material support is monetary, weapons, training, personnel, resources, services, expert advice, assistance or contribution that furthers terrorism, any contribution that furthers terrorism, or legitimizes a terrorist organization's activities. Okay, I'm still in. I like it. Right? But with this definition, people who function all over the world, especially very big charities, people serving humanity, sometimes they work in conflict zones. Sometimes they work where the area is unstable and there's politics involved. The government has a friend and the government has an enemy. And these organizations, knowing that this law exists, want to follow it. They have no politics. They have no desire to break the law. But they ask the government for a little clarity because we understand that this material support is a serious issue that needs to be dealt with. But we would like some clarity. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. Now, based on the definition I gave you, right, I'm going to ask you if what I say would be included into material support. Fair? Khalil Meek, an American, goes and he decides he wants to help people. Tomorrow, I leave and I fly over to Gaza, Palestine. And I get into Gaza and I put up a sign, I say, if you're hungry, come eat. I just want to help people. I could care less who they are, anything about them. I don't even know how to speak the language. But I put up a sign, I'm a charity, if you're hungry, come eat. The next day, 200 people come, and I feed them. Alhamdulillah. After feeding 200 people, the next day, I find out that 3 people who came to my charity, who ate my food, are associated with a terrorist organization. I fed 3 terrorists. Is that material support?
Yes.
Hold on. Let's say the next day I'm there. It's time to get a haircut. I still don't speak the language. I see a barber pole. I walk up to the shop. I walk in. I point to my hair. He points to the chair. I sit down. He cuts my hair. He holds up 10 fingers. I hand him $10. So that afternoon, I pick up the paper. I'm reading an article, and whose picture is in there? My barber. I read the bit. He's associated with the terrorist organization. I gave him $10. Is that material support? Okay, I'm tired of playing this game. Let's finish. I find out who's in charge. I go straight to the person of this terrorist organization. I look him in the eye and you say, I hate what you do. What you do causes more harm than good. I think you need to find a peaceful solution tomorrow. The sooner you find a peaceful solution, the better. All conflict ends in peace. Here is an example of Jesus, peace be upon him, how he would do. Here's an example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Here's an example of Gandhi. Here's the example of Jimmy Carter. The best roadmap to peace ever. please stop what you're doing, follow this. So I gave advice to a terrorist.
Bye.
Is that material support?
Yeah. According to the government, yeah. Keep on for you. FEMA camps.
Everybody's giggling, but these questions have been asked of the government. Say, hey, we want to be clear, right? We don't want to get in trouble. We want to know the answer. The government refused to answer. They said, here's the definition. There was a lawsuit initiated by a lot of charities who sued the government for clarity. Said, hey, we're tired of guessing. It's called the Humanitarian Law Project. The Humanitarian Law Project was led by David Cole, a constitutional scholar at Georgetown University, who pressed the issue, went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court in 2010 came back and said, we're not going to clarify. We're going to allow the Department of Justice to use its discretion. If the Department of Justice thinks what it sees could be considered material support, it's allowed to indict. It can charge you with a crime. You're innocent till proven guilty. So then they can take it to court and argue their theory to the jury. If the jury agrees, they can convict. You'll find out in court. With that much discretion, we're here to share with you how creative the United States government has been with that authority. One of the things that we want you to know is that as we move forward, we're not talking about people who've hurt anybody and now they have to stand trial and see if they had a just cause for it. We're not hearing about people who have maimed or murdered or destroyed something, right? And whether or not it was justified. We're going to talk about people who have exercised what we consider as this country to be free speech, advocacy, protest, dissent, ideology, humanitarian aid, blending lawful conduct into criminal activity. Or, let me say that. Yeah, blending lawful conduct into criminal prosecutions. We want you to be very familiar with what's taking place around us. And if you like it, go home, sleep good. It's happening. If you don't like it, then hopefully this will resonate tonight, what we're trying to say, what we're trying to do, and that together we can try to make a difference. Moving on, this discretion that the Department of Justice has used has led it to a point where it's not only looking at things from a perspective of lawful or unlawful, but it's looking at things as potential threat based on current behavior. How many of you have heard the term preemptive prosecution? How about this? How many of you saw a Hollywood blockbuster movie called Minority Report with Tom Cruise a few years ago? This is a fiction movie in the future. But the premise of the movie is that law enforcement is so sophisticated, it's smarter. It has computers that can actually tell it where crime will be committed before it happens. 10 or 15 minutes before any crime, the police start to rush to the scene of the crime, arrest the would-be criminal, and there's no crime in the future. Preemptive law enforcement. Today, based on the recommendation of Dick Cheney after 9/11, he's stated what is now referred to as the 1% doctrine. Dick Cheney thought, in response to terrorism, that the Department of Justice and law enforcement should use the 1% rule. And the theory is that if anything that they see in somebody, again, their ideology, their behavior, they pray too much, they say too much, whatever, that if they show a 1% chance, 1% chance, that they could pose a threat to the United States in the future, then I want you to act today as if that is a certainty. So start acting as if you see anything out there that has a 1% chance of harming anything, ever, just potential, as if it's going to happen. So act as if that's reality. So the government, in response to that, has gone out and seen somebody that has an ideology, that has a demeanor, who has a profile, and then they've acted upon that either by befriending them or trying to get them to do something in furtherance of an unlawful act. And many, many times they have approached people who basically just said, you know, whatever you've got in your head is not what I have in mind, leave me alone. But in the process of doing this, the government doesn't stop. It just continues to try to bring people. So it ends up with a lot of people that are considered the low-hanging fruit, people that, you know, might want recognition, people that just don't have anybody to talk to, people that don't have any money, people that have no friends. And they start visiting with them, and these people then start feeling empowered and somehow a feeling of betterment. And the government has been 100% successful today in convicting people that they have led from the beginning to the end to do something that would be considered harmful had any of it been real. I'll let Steve talk more about these types of prosecutions, but I want to talk for a few minutes about how these cases, and I really want you to get the flavor of this. Let's say in a preemptive prosecution, right? We had a case, we didn't, but there was a case in North Carolina. It's called the Raleigh 7. And based on the government's prosecution of 7 individuals, the jury came back with a verdict. And the verdict read like this: we, the jury, find the defendants guilty of a conspiracy to provide material support to an unknown terrorist organization at an unknown time in an unspecified place. Do I need to repeat that?
No.
They're guilty of what? Nothing. An assumption. It's kind of like having a profile of a bank robber, right? Let's say the FBI came in today saying, here is the exact profile of a bank robber. Bank robbers like to attend civil liberties events. Bank robbers wear blue shirts to these events and khaki green pants. They're over 40. They sit next to women in pink. And based on this profile, I would think that you, sir, look like a bank robber. But we can't be sure. Are there any banks in Richardson? There are banks in Richardson. Have you ever been to a bank? You've been to a bank. Do you own a car? You have a car. So now we've got a profile. There are banks in the area. This man has been to a bank before. He owns a getaway car. Right? He looks like a terrorist. I'm telling you that all of this information should lead you to conclude he's about to rob a bank. You get my drift? You see what we're talking about? This is taking place. And not only is it taking place in this objective type, environment of politics of fear, where you've got the media hype, borderline propaganda, people like Fox News that are creating animosity, mistrust. You got political rhetoric like Peter King and his hearings, the anti-Sharia laws, radical right saying whatever they want with no impunity. And then from what we're hearing in the media and what we're seeing around us, and we're having these new theoretical type trials, inside the courtroom is where things are really changing. And this is where the Muslim Legal Fund can share our experience and what is taking place in the courtroom and why we think it's very important for all of us to do something. In these trials, not only is the government coming up with whatever theory that they think is rational, and they want to present it to a jury, and they're allowed to do that, but when you get to court, they're challenging all of the 200 years of civil liberties and civil rights issues that this country's been founded on, saying that we no longer should follow this road because security outweighs liberty. And they say that we need to have new laws. We need to have things like secret evidence. Right? We got to have some secret evidence. We don't need everybody to know what we know. We need to have anonymous experts in a courtroom. Did you hear what I said? Anonymous expert. That's somebody who testifies as an expert on a fact that you don't know who they are. So they, most experts get challenged by their credibility, right? Their good name, right? If somebody's a child molester, a bank robber, a thief, a thug, and a convict, but now he's in court today as an expert, I can't challenge that because I don't know that. I don't know who he is or she is. I get to see them. They are a claimed expert. I can ask them questions, but I can't vet them. Anonymous experts. We have the government saying over and over in cases that they need to be able to take this latitude to step a departure from our normal rules and processes so that they can convince the jury of their theory. And what's happening, we're getting 200 years of precedents being challenged, not only daily, but judges and juries and appellate courts all divided on how to move forward. Right now, the arguments are coming that, okay, we need to do this, and some judge says, no way, that's just not going to happen in my courtroom. Another judge says, well, if the government needs it, it should have it, and yes, you can do it. And so this judge rules one way, this judge a different way. This jury one way, this jury a different way. Another, you go to the appellate level, the appellate courts are divided. They say, well, this judge didn't make any errors. Yes, this judge didn't make errors, and they're divided. Then it goes to the Supreme Court to sort it out. Right now, nothing's finished. But right now, there are victims laying all over the place who have been touched by this national security type cases that when we get into the mechanics of them and you start to see some of these cases, I'll talk to you about one of them. How many of you are familiar with the Holy Land Foundation right here in Dallas, Texas? Right? You understand the government's theory, right? The government said the Holy Land was the largest source of funding for Hamas in America and closed it by executive order, December 2001. And after shutting it down in 2001, it seized all of its assets, all of its records, and started to go through every transaction the Holy Land ever did. So you got 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, 4 years of thorough investigation. After 4 years, the government comes back and says that everything the Holy Land did went to humanitarian aid, food, clothing, shelter, education, and medical supplies. We said, Alhamdulillah. That means praise God. You got it right. But the Department of Justice said, no, Alhamdulillah. We said, why? They said, we now know what was going on. We said, tell us what's going on. They said, yes, they're providing humanitarian aid. The Holy Land did nothing but provide food, clothing, shelter, education, and medical supplies to the people who needed it the most. They focused their efforts mostly in Palestine. And the theory the government said is, we think we know what was going on. We asked them for clarity. They said, well, they would send the aid to Palestine to what are called charities in Palestine, zakat committees. And that the zakat committees in Palestine made the delivery. Our theory is the zakat committee is under the influence of Hamas. And that when they delivered the aid, it was winning the hearts and minds of the Palestinians for the organization of Hamas. And that love and affection is material support. We have cases where people, and right now, just so you know, in the Holy Land trial, they use anonymous experts. They stretch the rules of evidence beyond recognition. They let people testify way beyond their scope. We had the appellate court in New Orleans come back and tell us that the district court made 4 major errors, but that they were harmless. Now it's before, this is our first case to the Supreme Court. So this case is now sitting in front of the Supreme Court to see if this country wants to have anonymous experts at trial. And not only have we argued the position that, this is not what this country needs, but the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, that's the NACDL, 50,000 lawyers, judges, retired military, the mainstream body of criminal defense in the United States, agrees with us on this issue. They wrote an amicus brief. They submitted it to the Supreme Court, and they went back and even briefed 2,000 years of Western law. They said from the time of Rome to Britain till today, that Western law has been against this idea for a reason. right? It goes against transparency. It goes against checks and balances. It goes against openness and confronting your accusers and being able to have a meaningful day in court. You know, somebody can have secret evidence, anonymous experts, and, you know, you all got a Christmas present in December. Do you remember what that was? It's called the National Defense Authorization Act, signed by Obama on Christmas Eve. The National Defense Authorization Act is a piece of legislation that is now signed into law, allowing the military can capture or detain any civilian without charge, giving them no right to a trial, no right to an attorney, no limitation on geography or citizenship, including American citizens on American soil. That's martial law. That means the military can do what it thinks it needs to do, and we don't care how many civil liberties and civil rights you have and what this Constitution and your founding fathers had. We now have the right to act like Russia, Stalin, Hitler. I mean, it doesn't matter. Now we've even gone beyond that and said the president has the right to issue assassination, right? Executive order to kill somebody, a U.S. citizen, and he doesn't have any oversight, and he doesn't have to get permission, and he doesn't have to give you his reasons why. You can just end up dead because he thought it was a good idea. These issues, the Muslim Legal Fund, as a charity, has been taking cases over the last 10 or 11 years. You have a book with you tonight. We encourage you to please take it home, to read it, to thumb through it, learn about what we do. A lot of you already know the information, but I see a lot of new people tonight. So I really want you to understand the work we're doing. So we're hiring the best attorneys, we're hiring the best experts, we're hiring people that, any of you ever hired an attorney in here? Raise your hand. Just have you ever hired an attorney? What did you pay him per hour?
400.
400. Blurt it out. Per hour. 200. What else?
650.
650 an hour. The bank robber. He's got money.
Washington lawyer.
Criminal defense attorneys, anywhere from $250 to $750 an hour. Let's say you need a criminal defense attorney, and you have to deal with a national security issue. You've gone about your business, serving humanity, all of a sudden you find out all the work you've done is somehow affecting the government and they want to prosecute you. How many hours do you think it would take an attorney to represent you? 500 to 1,000 hours. If not more. If it's more complicated, it takes longer. But on average, about 1,000 hours, 18 months to get to trial, all the depositions, all the discovery, all the information, motions brief, that takes a lot of work. If you paid a lawyer $250 an hour for 1,000 hours, how much is that? $250,000. How many of you have $250,000 in case you need it? See me outside. Nobody. So what is your recourse? Let's say you have to deal with this issue. Now you have to go to court. I don't have $250,000. Well, you can have a public defender. Right? This country believes in the right that it can accuse you of anything, but if you can't afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. So you can have a public defender. Somebody that goes to court. Might even care about the issue. Might even try to defend you. Might even try to do whatever is capable of to represent you. But by no means are they the expert that you would like to have at your side on any of the issues you're going to be facing. Right? They're not up to speed on the national security issues, the motions, the briefs, the witnesses, nothing that's taking place in the courtroom. And your life stands in the balance of somebody who's going to do their best to help you out. Or communities like us, organizations like ours can be a vehicle for us to ask the community to stand behind some of these cases, the ones that have the greatest impact, affecting the most people, that the issues there are the ones that we all care about, and we can hire the best lawyers, the best experts, and we can get in the courtroom and give a meaningful defense and give them an opportunity to tell their side of the story and be able to, just like I said, tell what their side of the story is without having, you know, a kangaroo type court atmosphere. So this is the work that we're doing. We're doing a lot of this work. Now, because you can't win a battle just by playing defense, we're trying to set good precedent. We're trying to take the strongest issues. We're trying to argue them as adamantly as we can in as many places as we can do it. But we need to take another step, and that is not only be reactive, but to be proactive. So the Muslim Legal Fund, in an effort to be proactive, has several projects going on right now. One is called the National Security Defense Project. It's a fellow that we're funding at the University of Texas. And at the University of Texas, they've agreed to house the fellowship. We've agreed to fund it. And this fellowship is creating a database, and it's using a lot of this information that's been collected by people like Steve Downs and his organization, Project Salam, for the last 10 years. Has a database of how many clients in it?
800 names.
800?
800 names.
800 names in it. It's taking that as a foundation, and then it's adding to it all the motions, the briefs, the indictments, the rulings by the judges. It's putting together all the experts, what the government has ruled, what the government has gone against, favorable, unfavorable. It's creating an intensive informational network so that any criminal defense attorney in the U.S. who has to deal with one of these issues at trial can call upon the clinic, and the clinic will provide the information to the lawyer or go and argue an issue on behalf of that case, or take the case itself on impact litigation anywhere in the country. We committed $300,000 to that project beginning in January 2012. We're also beginning to fund, as an organization, the Muslim Legal Fund now has more experience, and we're non-lawyers, more experience in national security cases of this nature than any organization in the U.S. We have been funding cases, and almost all of, not all of these cases, but all of our cases are included in these cases, or at least some of them, that are, now we're getting to a point where we have the attorneys that have the most experience. We know the organizations that are standing up, like the ACLU, the Center for Constitutional Rights, the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, the National Lawyers Guild, the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and on the people that are there. We're working with them. And now we've decided that it is in our best interest and their best interest if we find a way to work together in a fashion that not only are we trying to do the same thing, but we create the synergies behind it. So we've actually funded a fellow this year, the first time at the Bill of Rights Defense Committee. We pay for an employee to work for them under their guidance, but the idea is for them to work on these issues in their circle of influence so that what we're talking about is being resonated to another 50,000 people that they talk to. And together we're going to try to make a difference. Now this coalition has come together where you have the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, the Center for Constitutional Rights, you've got how many 20 organizations that are working together on a national level to say, okay, we're all like-minded, we all care about these issues, we all see what's going on, and in fact, how many of you have heard of an analogy called a canary in a coal mine? Anybody ever heard that? Do you know what it means? Miners digging underground, right, for coal, that's dangerous work, but sometimes there's a gas that's released whenever you're digging for coal, and you can't smell it, you can't taste it, you breathe too much of it, you die. Well, coal miners started dying, and they wondered why. Then they figured out it was this gas. Then they wanted to figure out how to stop it. Well, they came up with a brilliant idea. They said, let's take a canary with us into the coal mine. The canary is affected by the gas. So when the gas starts coming, the canary will breathe it, can't taste it, can't smell it, but it'll kill the canary way before it kills you. When the canary falls over, it's time to get out of the mine. Right? It's a warning bell. Well, what's happening today is the civil rights and civil liberties community is starting to look at the Muslims as the canary in the coal mine. They're like, yeah, we see it. Yeah, that poor canary might get, knocked over. But that gas that comes with it is coming for all of us. And is that what we want? Is that where we're headed? I think I'm taking too long here. But I'm enjoying this. You enjoying this? So tonight, I want to give an opportunity for our guest speakers who are more articulate and can really expand upon this. But I want you to get an idea of what we're trying to do. How many of you think what you've heard so far is important? How many of you think that what we're doing is what we should be doing? Oh, he's giving me 5 more minutes. 3 minutes. How many of you are going to help us tonight when we ask you for your support? Well, I lost some of them. What I want to do now is basically, I think you get the idea that with this coalition that's being built, you have organizations working on their circle of influence already. And they're not here to ask you for donations for their organizations. But what's happening is the coalition's coming together, and everybody needs to have these issues articulated, focused on, so you need to have somebody in the media for all the organizations to work together. You need to have a staff of somebody on the legal issues. You need to have a staff of somebody who's on the political issues, so that all of this effort can be centralized. So the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms now wants to take the next step and have, okay, we want to have a staff, we want to make this formal, we want to do this work even better and stronger. So they focused on these preemptive prosecutions. They're focused on the CMUs, the effects of prisoners around the country. They're focused on the families who have been devastated by these cases, which they're going to talk about tonight. And so they're going to be using resources to bring families together in a social network. They're going to be using legislation to take the CMUs and the communication management units back to Normalville. And we're going to be looking at preemptive prosecutions as un-American and as something that this country doesn't stand for and it doesn't want. And the Muslim Legal Fund is going to continue swinging the way we're doing. We're adding our way to their way, they're adding their voice to our voice, and together, inshallah, we'll make a difference. So I want to thank you for coming tonight. We appreciate the people being here. And I want to introduce our next guest, who's going to share with us more about the coalition, the work they're doing, and why we all should make that difference. His name is Steve Downs. He is one of the founders of an organization called Project Salam. I think it's in Albany, New York. Project Salam saw this issue many years ago and started to build that database that we're now talking about expanding and improving. And he has been taking these issues not only to heart, but as a, tell me what kind of lawyer, you discipline judges, but what?
Discipline judge. I was just a lawyer disciplining bad judges in the New York State system.
You like that? I like that. A lawyer who disciplines bad judges, who is here tonight to share with us the project, the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms. Please welcome Steve Downs.
I'd love to hear Khalil talk. He is my soul brother, really. He can express the kind of things that I think better than I can, because he's so passionate about it, and he sees these cases, and he understands how the ground has shifted over the last few years into a completely different legal landscape, a completely different landscape than any of us have grown up with. I'll just share quickly a little bit of my journey. I was with the Commission on Judicial Conduct for most of my legal career, disciplining bad judges. And after that, when I retired in 2003, an imam in Albany, New York, named Yasin Araf, right down here, was accused by the government of terrorism. And I volunteered to work on the legal defense, and it changed my life. The government decided to go after Yasin Araf for reasons we don't know. They, for some reason, felt that his ideology was suspect in some way. We don't know why. But in any event, this was a classic preemptive prosecution. And what they did was they set him up with a sting. The whole thing was completely made up by the FBI. But basically, all that happened was that there was a loan occurred in which there were 6 payments. And all that Yasin did was ask to come in and witness the loans in the classic Islamic way that imams do. It's completely legal. There was nothing wrong with witnessing a loan. Imams do that all the time, and it's essentially like being a notary. How many people have ever notarized the document? All right. That's basically all you're being asked to do. But the catch here, the way they caught him, was just while he was going through counting the money and checking the papers before he notarized or before he witnessed the loan, they had conversations which suggested that the proceeds of the loan came from an illegal source, the sale of a missile. And so, because he should have known, and then this is the government argument, because he should have known that the proceeds of the loan were set from the sale of a missile, therefore, he contributed materially to the support of a terrorist organization. That was the theory. Now, the evidence that the government had was simply ridiculous. It was garbled conversations that didn't make any sense. The case actually came down to 1 or 2 sentences, which he might have heard if he'd been paying attention. And it was presented to a jury, and the jury found that 5 of the conversations, he was not guilty. He could not have reasonably figured out that this had anything to do with a terrorist organization, but they convicted him on the 6th. And we were delighted, because the 6th conversation had had a problem because the government had used a code word for missile. They used Chowdhury instead of missile, and so if you didn't know what the code was, it wouldn't have made any sense. And there was no evidence, not one stick of evidence in the record that he knew what the code was. And he denied that he knew it. So we said, fine, we're home free. We'll go up on appeal, we'll get this thing reversed. So we filed a brief in court, and the government filed their brief. And then the government filed a secret brief that we weren't allowed to see. Then the government filed a top secret brief that even the prosecutor wasn't allowed to see. It came straight out of Washington, out of Dick Cheney's office or something. I don't know. And then we went in and we argued our case in the appellate court, and the government argued their case, and then we were excused, and the government argued their case secretly before the appellate court. And when the decision came down, the court apparently agreed with our position that the sixth conversation could not be sustained. There was no proof he knew the code. So they never mentioned it. Instead, they convicted him on all the evidence in the first 5 charges that the jury had seen and decided he was not guilty. So he was effectively convicted based solely on evidence for which had been presented to a jury, and the jury had cleared him. And at that point, I began to realize something had shifted. This was not the legal framework, the courtroom that I knew, that I had ever experienced. And it was from that realization that we began Project Salam, to try to document what was going on, and we realized this was going on all across the country. We had literally hundreds and hundreds of these cases that in form appeared to be real prosecutions, but in fact were not. These were fake. These were cases that were made up by the government, and they were going to get their conviction. The conviction was already preordained. The only question was, how was the government going to try to make it look like this was an honest case? And so eventually the Project Salam came together with 20 other organizations, or 19 other civil rights and Muslim organizations, to form the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms. And the question, I guess, he's already told you some of the mainstream organizations. These are big organizations: the Center for Constitutional Rights, the Muslim Legal Fund of America, ISNA, AMA. And so you'll say, well, why then would these groups get together to form an organization? What do we need the coalition for? Surely these organizations by themselves have sufficient resources to take on these cases. And I want to explain that to you a little bit. Because what our coalition does is it fills a hole, a gap, in what we normally think of as civil rights. Traditional civil rights organizations represent individuals when their rights are threatened. But how do you represent somebody, or how do you defend somebody, when their very religious beliefs and ideology are made criminal? It is a problem, because a civil rights organization can represent your right to say what your religious beliefs are, but they can't exactly represent the civil rights beliefs themselves. That's not their role. It is up to the religion to defend their own religious beliefs. And for example, to make it clear, just take the word jihad. The word jihad is heard very differently in Muslim organizations, or Muslims generally, from non-Muslims in our society, at least for those who are not well educated in this. And of course, in a Muslim society, jihad is the word struggle. It literally means the word to struggle, and there is internal struggle to come to the right and the just way of behaving. To a non-Muslim, they hear it and they think of somehow a holy war. And so if you use the word in emails or in conversation, and you discuss the role of Muslims in defending their religion against attack in other parts of the world, and you use the word jihad, if that word is then criminalized and becomes the basis on which you're preemptively prosecuted, this is very difficult for civil rights organizations to get around when they don't themselves understand Islam that well. So you need to bring in the Muslim organizations. But the Muslim organizations themselves have a problem with this, because in a society that is full of Islamophobia, if they try to defend a certain language, they will be attacked themselves and marginalized and called terrorist organizations. And a lot of what they try to say is not legitimized. They have no credibility with many organizations. And so it is in the interest of both the civil rights organizations and the Muslim organizations to come together to form a coalition that together we can try to bridge this gap and talk both as Muslims and as civil rights people on how this particular crisis in civil rights should be handled. I'm going to skip ahead because we've got some really good people coming up. And I just wanted to indicate particularly that among the things that we are doing in the National Coalition to try to improve the situation is, as he's mentioned, we have, as Claude's mentioned, we have a database, which we're very proud of. We think this is the best database in the country right now. And we are trying to mine this database to look for patterns. What is the government doing? How are they doing it? How are they convincing juries to convict people that, to all objective appearances, are completely innocent? In January, we're organizing a group of the best legal minds in the country, Muslim and non-Muslim, to come together, and we're going to lock them up in a room, and we're going to thrash out what it is that we can do better. How can we try these cases better? How can we raise these issues better? How can we present this to juries in a way that they can understand? How do we educate people about Islam and the way Muslims talk to each other to diffuse the sense that wherever two Muslims are talking together and the government says it's a conspiracy, that they must be talking about terror? This is a problem that the legal profession simply has to face and deal with, and so this is one thing we hope to get out of this meeting. We are trying to affect how public perception is, of Muslims are seeing. We publish a newsletter that contains information about civil rights cases, and we hold press conferences to correct misimpressions. We had a case recently in which a young man from Pittsburgh contacted us, this is just an example, and said, you know, I'm being followed around by the FBI. The FBI is trying to talk me, they have these agent provocateurs that come on, they try to be your best friend, and they try to talk you into being, committing crimes and saying things that can get me locked up. And I'm sick of it. I'm tired of it. They've been doing this for years. And I want it to stop. And so he checked in, and sure enough, he was absolutely correct. He'd identified these people, and they were two notorious agent provocateurs from the FBI that had followed other people around, including Yassine Arif, and the Newburgh Four, and Tariq Shah, and you'll see all these names up here, and had gotten them convicted. And so he said, all right, the only way, the best way we think we can fight this is to call a press conference and denounce the FBI and say they shouldn't be doing this. So we did. We called a press conference. And don't you know, the FBI, the day before the press conference, went and arrested the young man on a trumped up weapons charge and held him in jail, so he couldn't attend the press conference. We went ahead with it anyway. I think the FBI was very embarrassed by it. The charges are still pending. We've got lawyers for him. We're trying to help him. But I think that, in a sense, by doing that, we prevented him from being charged and convicted of something far more serious. One of the things that we're trying to do, of course, is educate people. Education is absolutely key. We go all over the country giving talks like this and in many other places to try to educate people as to what's happening with preemptive prosecution. And everywhere I go, I hear people say, and they come up to me and they say, why haven't we heard about this in the media? Why don't we read about this? And of course, there's a very good reason. The government does not want you to know about it. And so we have an extra burden, I think, to go around and try to convince people and tell people the seriousness of this. And we have an education committee that is trying to get legislation passed that will remedy some of these problems. We are trying to change the material support laws to require that before you can be convicted of material support for terrorism, you have to intend to commit terror. For example, we have over here, the pink folks over there on the wall are peace activists. Those are people who went to the Middle East and other countries where there's conflict trying to bring peace. And they are now being attacked and charged with material support for terrorism simply for trying to bring peace. And we say the law should be changed to say, no, if you're trying to bring peace, you don't intend to engage in terror, you should not be convicted of it. We want to revoke the indefinite detention provisions of the National Defense Authorization Act, and we want to eliminate solitary confinement, a completely cruel form of torture that just simply should not exist. But we also, uniquely among all of the groups, we have one particular legislative project that we want to do, we want to look back. All these other ones are looking forward, trying to improve things. But we want to look back because we have a large number of people that are locked up in jail, and we want to get them out. And as it turns out, the Inspector General of the Justice Department conducted an examination of what the Justice Department was doing, and they realized that the Justice Department was not turning over to the defense evidence of the defendant's innocence. Now, by law, they're required to do it. If they have evidence showing that the defendant is innocent, they have to turn it over. And they are not doing that, particularly in terrorism cases. There is classified evidence in all of these cases, and they simply have no mechanism to go back through it to find exculpatory evidence. So their own Inspector General said they have to review all of these terrorism cases to find cases in which they failed to turn over exculpatory evidence. And since we believe these cases are basically all phony cases, there must be a mountain of exculpatory information in the prosecutor's files. And if they did that, we believe a large percentage of these cases, these defendants could be free from very, very long prison sentences. Now, of course, the Department of Justice is simply ignoring what their own Inspector General is telling them to do. So the only way we can force this is to try to get Congress to pass a law that would require that they review all of these terrorism cases. So this is a top priority for our coalition. Finally, I just want to mention that we have a committee that does focuses on prisoners and their families. These are particularly important cases to us. In many, many cases, when charges are brought, preemptive prosecution charges are brought, families and the prisoners are abandoned by their communities, by their friends, and many prisoners are even abandoned by their families itself. And they may end up in solitary confinement for years without any contact with the outside world. And the families are very often cut off from their communities. They are isolated and afraid. We are trying to gather them together particularly because we feel that if they could be together in one place, could talk to each other, this could lead to healing. It could also lead to the families raising their voice to protest what was done to them by the government. This November, we're going to have a conference in which we're going to bring all of these families together, or at least as many as we can get, and try to have them discuss and talk out and bond together so that their voices will be heard collectively. One voice saying, I'm objecting to what the government did to my husband, doesn't resonate because maybe he was a terrorist. But if you have a large group talking about this, they can build support for themselves. As for the prisoners, for example, one of the things we did this year was during Ramadan, we collected information about the 100 most needy prisoners. And we sent $100 to their commissary account so that they would know that they had not been forgotten. And we got reports back from prisoners who were in some of these jails that when these people, sometimes for the first time in years, received any communication and knew that there was an organization out there that still cared about them, the tears were just coming down with relief that they had not been forgotten. So these are some of the things that we're trying to do. We're trying to accomplish as a coalition, and we are doing it in partnership with the Muslim Legal Fund. They are truly our soulmates in this, and I cannot thank them enough for it. And so I think with that, I'm going to urge you all, I want you to explain that what we're trying to do requires a lot of resources. We are still a small organization that is trying to reach out over the whole country to change the perception of what's going on in this country legally, to change the perception of the people themselves, the Muslims that are being preemptively prosecuted. And we simply have to expand our reach. We have to expand the people that we can bring to this organization. And so we need resources. This is vital for what we do. And I hope you all will be very generous tonight.
Thank you very much. Now, I know that you guys are all anxious for me to get up and talk for another 35 minutes. I'm very honored to introduce our next guest, and all of you are very, I can tell by the looks on your faces, are very excited to see him. And that is Glenn Greenwald, a political journalist, a lawyer, a columnist, a blogger, an author. He's also been ranked one of the top 25 most influential persons in the media. He's been ranked one of the top 25 most influential political pundits. He's been a contributor to the New York Times, the LA Times, and The Guardian. He's also been featured on MSNBC, ABC, and even the Colbert Report. And tonight, we bring him live to you from Dallas, Texas. Please help me welcome Glenn Greenwald.
Good evening. Thanks for that, and thanks very much for coming tonight, and thank you as well to the National Coalition to Protect Civil Freedoms and the Muslim Legal Fund of America for inviting me here tonight and for the truly crucial work that they do on behalf of people who, if these organizations didn't exist and weren't able to do the work, would really have virtually nobody to turn to. For the past 6 or 7 years, literally on a daily basis, I've been writing about the systematic civil liberties abuses in the United States and the war on terror which justifies them and the severe Islamophobia that drives the crux of it. But for the past 2 or 3 years, I've been spending increasing amounts of time going around the country speaking at events like this about those same issues. And the reason why I do that, the reason why that's become so important to me is because virtually every city that I visit in the United States, I'm able to interact with the human beings whose lives have been devastated, literally, by the injustices that we've been talking about tonight. And the reason that is so important for me to do is because it's somewhat easy and tempting when you write about civil liberties abuses and you write about these injustices to consider them at some point as abstractions. Even for those of us who find them deeply disturbing and dangerous and objectionable, it's often easy to think about them and to confine them just to our rational faculties, to think about them almost as intellectual exercises, and to think about the reasons why they're so wrongful. And what interacting with the people whose lives are harmed by these injustices do, and not only them, but their family members, their children, their parents, their friends, the members of their community, is that it really highlights on a very visceral level exactly why these injustices are so severe, why they're so disturbing. And speaking just for myself, it really emboldens the work that I do and makes me more determined than ever to continue doing what I can to combat them. Now, one of the interesting aspects about the persecution of Muslim Americans in the post 9/11 era is that it's so pervasive that almost every city I visit, as I said, presents an opportunity to speak with people whose lives have been harmed by these injustices. And oftentimes what happens is I visit a city where, unbeknownst to me, there are people in them who are classic cases of these abuses, ones that I was not aware of until I visited that city. So I'll just give you one example. Last week, I spoke to the University of Missouri Law School. And that law school is located in Columbia, Missouri, which is a fairly typical small college town. And Columbia, Missouri happens to be the home of Dr. Shakir Hammoudi, whose son and son-in-law I was able to meet with, and hear his truly remarkable story that really affected me so much that I literally woke up the next morning early just in order to write about it and bring it to as many people's attention as I could. Dr. Hammoudi in 1985 was an Iraqi student who decided that he wanted to come to the United States to obtain a PhD in nuclear engineering. And he came to Missouri and enrolled at the University of Missouri and obtained his PhD. And when he was finished, he and his wife decided that they wanted to stay in the United States rather than return to Iraq, and they proceeded to have 5 children, all American-born US citizens. But the problem that he encountered was that his family, virtually all of his family, including his 11 siblings and his elderly blind mother, were back in Iraq. And like millions and millions of Iraqis, literally millions and millions, they were suffering severe deprivation, including borderline starvation, as a result of the sanctions regime imposed on that country by the United States and its allies. And like any decent human being would do, although he was making a very modest living, he could not in good conscience allow himself to have any discretionary income, while he knew that his brothers and sisters, including a surgeon in Iraq who was making $2 a month as a result of sanctions, and his mother who was incapable of buying the medicine she needed, he was incapable of allowing them to suffer so greatly while he had any ability to help them. And so he began finding ways to send very small amounts of money back to Iraq so that his family could literally eat and have sustenance and a place to live. And the problem at the time was that the law in the United States, the sanctions regime, barred and criminalized the sending of money back to Iraq, but he did it anyway because he could not let his family suffer that way. And when other Iraqi American families in Colombia learned that he was doing that, they too wanted to participate, and he then began accepting money on their behalf and sending over the course of the next decade, from 1993 to 2003, roughly $50 to $75 a month, which was enough to keep 14 families of Iraqi Americans in his community back in Iraq alive, just barely alive. In 2002 and 2003, Dr. Hammoudi, who by now was a U.S. citizen himself, became one of the most outspoken opponents of the proposed attack on Iraq. And he was a particularly credible and threatening opponent because with expertise in nuclear engineering, he was incredibly well positioned to alert the world to the fact that Saddam almost certainly did not have any active nuclear weapons program. And he was able to talk about the ways in which great instability and human suffering would be unleashed if the United States removed that regime, along with other foreign invaders. Essentially, he was able to warn the world that everything that ended up happening, including the falsehoods on which the war was based, would happen. And he attracted the attention and interest of the U.S. government for that reason. And then in 2006, 3 years later after the war commenced, 35 federal agents showed up at his house without warning, armed and many of them with guns drawn, while his 2 teenage children were at home, and announced that they had a search warrant, which they then proceeded to execute in his house. They spent 9 hours in his house. They took everything they could find, passports of every family member, identification, letters, heirlooms, photos, documents, cards, everything they could find, none of which to this day, 6 years later, has been returned. And only 3 years later was he finally charged with a crime, was he indicted with anything, and that charge was a technical violation of the sanctions law that barred money from being sent back to Iraq. It was, as he called it and admitted, a crime of compassion. The government did not ever contend that that money was intended for anything other than pure humanitarian assistance to his family members and those of others in the community. Nor does the government contend that the money ever went anywhere near Saddam's regime, or to the purchase of weapons, or the financing of terrorism, or anywhere else other than to feed these families and to enable them to buy medicine. The government completely acknowledges that that's what happened, and yet they prosecuted him very aggressively for this quote-unquote crime. 2 months ago, he stood in front of a federal judge in Missouri expecting to be given probation, because by now what he had done is not even a crime in the United States and hasn't been one for 9 years. And yet he was sentenced to 3 years in a federal penitentiary. And 2 weeks ago he began serving his sentence at Fort Leavenworth. And I heard his son and his son-in-law, his son who is a medical student at the college, and his son-in-law who is in the master's program in journalism, talk about the way that this prison sentence has devastated his family and him. He's a 60-year-old man, completely healthy, highly educated, an integral member of his community who is now forced to sit in a cage for the next 3 years for doing what any decent human being would have and should have done. And these are the kinds of stories that really make you understand that these injustices should not be thought about in an intellectual or in a stoic sense. These should move all of us in very real ways, and the work that I do is really dedicated toward trying to get other people to be similarly moved by these stories. Now, one of the things that I think about a lot and debate with myself a lot whenever I write about these issues or talk about these issues is whether what is happening to Muslims in the United States and the persecution and erosion of rights that has taken place in the post-9/11 era, whether there's really anything unique about it when compared to prior instances in American history. Because you could certainly make the argument that American history is basically one long history of minority groups who are marginalized and powerless being singled out for demonization in order to legitimize government abuses of power. Obviously, African Americans are the most prominent and intense example, but there are lots of others, including immigrants and accused communists and Japanese Americans and lots of other groups. And you can certainly make the argument that Muslims are simply the next group in this continuum, that they are just the chosen scapegoat of the moment in the same way that these prior groups were, and at some point in the future there will be someone who replaces them. But I'm not particularly convinced by that argument because I think that there are some pretty unique attributes for what we've seen over the last decade that are worth thinking about and that distinguish what's happening from those prior examples, by which I don't mean that they're worse, because I think it's very difficult and not fruitful to compare injustices to try and decide which ones are worse, but there are unique attributes of it that make it worth thinking about as its own. The first unique attribute that I think is worth thinking about in terms of this post-9/11 persecution is that all of it is justified and driven by multiple wars, foreign wars. And the reason that matters so much is because the primary tactic, the primary goal of governments whenever they're fighting foreign wars is to deny the humanity of those at whom the war is aimed, to dehumanize whatever group of people is affected by the war. And the reason that's necessary is because virtually no citizenry would tolerate the continuing killing and slaughter and imprisonment and suffering imposed on some foreign group of people unless their humanity were denied, unless there were some argument being continuously made that they deserve it. And so because we've had 2 full-scale invasions of Muslim countries, multiple drone bombings and lots of others, a torture regime that was set up that almost exclusively involved them, a prison camp in the middle of the Caribbean Sea that still exists that is designed to imprison them and almost exclusively them without charges of any kind. This dehumanization campaign has been intense and ongoing and has lasted for more than a decade by now. And one of the things that happens, one of the ways you dehumanize your victims is by simply removing them from anyone's thought process. There was a war reporter who was a rising star with MSNBC back in 2003 who covered the Iraq War by the name of Ashley Banfield. And she went to Iraq and generated a lot of attention for herself and came back and gave a speech at Kansas State University in April of 2003, just a month or so after the war began. And she talked about how disturbed she was by the way in which American media presents wars, and that the #1 taboo in American media coverage is to never allow any humanization of the victims. You talk about the heroic American soldiers, you talk about the successful missions, you show the bombs being launched, but you never show where they land or who they kill or what the stories of those human beings are, because the goal is to deny their humanity. And even more so than excluding them from our thought process, there is an active effort to link them to guilt and culpability and blame. So there was a recent revelation from the New York Times that the Obama administration has just adopted a new definition of the term militant, which is the term that media outlets in the United States use to describe anyone who is killed by an American drone or an American bomb. 8 militants were killed in Yemen, 12 militants were killed in Pakistan. And what this word militant means is any military-age male, meaning anyone over the age of 16 or under the age of probably 55, who is in the strike zone of an American weapon. Anyone who dies when an American bomb detonates is by definition a militant, which is really a synonym for terrorist. And so while you have American political leaders who like to say, well, we're not at war with Islam, and there are certainly the majority of Muslims who are peaceful, and we have nothing against them, the reality of the message that has been sent for more than a decade now is one of dehumanization and demonization of Muslims in general that really has shaped the mentality that drives the American thought process against this group. And that, I think, really is something that is unique and that distinguishes it from prior similar examples. Another unique distinguishing attribute is that as we move further and further away from the precipitating event, the event that justifies these civil liberties abuses, in this particular case, the abuses worsen and never improve. And the reason why that's so remarkable to me is if you look, for example, at the attack on Pearl Harbor that led to the internment of Japanese Americans, one of the most shameful and disgraceful incidents in American history, what you saw was a very intense bigotry that pervaded the country regarding Japanese Americans in the immediate aftermath of the attack. But once the war ended, Japanese Americans were integrated relatively quickly back into the society. The policies that were enacted to repress them were gone once the perceived immediate threat was gone. As the precipitating event became more and more distant, the repression became less and less. This is the typical pattern. And what you see in the United States with regard to 9/11 is actually the opposite. We see, even 11 years later, removed from that event, a continual and endless assault on civil liberties. It's never the case that powers that the government acquires or justifies are relinquished because the threat has diminished. It's always the case that even without another successful attack on American soil, the threat and the abuses continue to intensify. So we see so many more cases now where the FBI creates its own terror plots and induces and tricks and deceives usually young Muslims into joining them through manipulation and then imprisoning them for decades once they proudly announce, the FBI does, that they disrupted their own terror plot. We see this happening more and more now than we ever did before. And when you see material support cases and prosecutions, the relationship between those accused of materially supporting terrorist groups and the terrorist groups themselves are much less proximate, much more distant now than they ever were before. So within the last 18 months, there have been 3 cases, 3, of young Muslims, 2 of whom are students in American universities, being indicted for materially supporting a terrorist organization for doing nothing more than uploading YouTube clips that are very critical of U.S. foreign policy on the grounds that these YouTube clips are designed to glorify and justify the aims of terrorist organizations and were done in coordination with those groups. You see that intensifying worse and worse. And then I think the most disturbing example is that the President of the United States, not the prior one, the current one, has claimed the power to extrajudicially execute, assassinate anybody he wants, including American citizens, a decision that he makes in complete secrecy and with no transparency or checks of any kind, a new power that was really seized by the U.S. government only in the last 2 or 3 years in the name of terrorism as well. And that too is very unique to me, that as the precipitating event justifying these abuses gets further and further away, the abuses themselves worsen instead of improving. Another unique and distinguishing attribute, in my view, that makes this different is the importation of war powers into our domestic realm, onto American soil. And I'll explain what I mean by that. It has always been the case that leaders become most powerful, that all restraints on their power disappear whenever there is a war. Cicero, 2,000 years ago, said that when war starts, the law falls mute. In war, there is no such thing as law, which means there's no such thing on the limitations of the power of rulers. And that makes sense. If you think about a battlefield, soldiers kill each other without any charges or trial. They don't accuse the soldiers they're trying to kill of being guilty of anything. They simply shoot one another. And rulers are entitled to make decisions and make orders within the context of battlefields without any kinds of constraints, including war. In the 20th century, tried to impose some limits with the law of war, but by and large, those are systematically ignored, especially by large countries. And the thing that made the theories of George Bush and Dick Cheney so radical and extremist and menacing was that they announced that this war is a different kind of war because it is not confined to any battlefield. It's not confined to any physical space. There's no one place on the earth or 3 or 4 easily identifiable places on the earth where their powers are limitless. Instead, they announced the entire globe, the entire planet is one big battlefield, which means there are no limits on the powers they exercise. And that was what then justified them kidnapping and detaining and killing at will without appealing or having those decisions reviewed. And what we've seen over the last 3 years is a change in how those powers were exercised. Under George Bush and Dick Cheney, those powers were largely exercised in foreign countries outside of American soil. And yet now if you listen to national security and policy advisors in the United States, what these officials will say is no longer that the greatest national security threat is Al-Qaeda or various Al-Qaeda affiliates. What they say is the greatest national security threat is what they call homegrown terrorism, that the threat is now primarily within the borders of the United States. And the abuses that we've seen have been increasingly ones that are now domestic. So you see a lessening of Miranda rights, the decades-old protection for accused terrorist suspects apprehended in the United States, or proposed legislation to strip people of citizenship and therefore the protections of the Constitution, or as Khalil referenced, the NDAA at the end of 2011 that actually codified the power of indefinite detention on American soil. It is importing the most extreme powers of government, which are the powers of war, onto American soil more so than ever before. And then the last distinguishing attribute that I think is really worth highlighting, and this I think is probably the most odious, the most pernicious one to me, it's also probably the one that's somewhat difficult to describe, and that is the way in which extremism becomes very rapidly normalized. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. If you think about what happened in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, when the country was extremely traumatized and shocked by what had taken place, almost every sector of American society was incredibly acquiescent to whatever the government wanted. Whatever the government said it needed to keep the country safe, Congress was willing to give it, the media went along with it, and the citizenry by and large did as well. Everybody was very willing to simply hand over whatever power the government demanded without much challenge or questioning. And yet one of the few exceptions to that was the Patriot Act, which, when it was introduced, set off lots of alarms in lots of different circles. You can go and read op-eds in major newspapers, even in September of 2001, when nobody was questioning the government, warning that the Patriot Act was a truly extremist piece of legislation. Lots of prominent politicians and groups and civil liberties organizations warning that the detention and surveillance powers that it justified and that it codified were radical and un-American and were truly a danger. And so widespread was this perception, even in the wake of 9/11, the immediate aftermath, that this was a dangerous and radical piece of legislation, that the Congress that enacted it incorporated into it a provision that said that the powers the Patriot Act vests will expire within 4 years. It was a sunset provision that said this will have a limitation of 4 years. And the reason for that was the premise that the only reason these powers were justified, these radical powers was justified, was because of the crisis that 9/11 brought. And the idea was that this was not going to be a permanent part of American political life, that it would expire after 4 years once the crisis receded. And yet, 4 years later, the Congress, without any real controversy, enacted the Patriot Act again, extended all of its provisions without any reform, even though there was abundant evidence that it was being abused. 4 years later, in 2009, the Obama administration demanded its extension again, and the Senate, with almost no debate whatsoever, only a few dissenting votes, again extended the Patriot Act without any notice or controversy. What was once a radical piece of legislation 10 short years ago, even with the World Trade Center still smoldering, in a few short years became something that we just all passively accept. Nobody talks about the Patriot Act anymore. No one objects to it. No one thinks of it as a radical piece of legislation. It has become completely normalized as part of our political framework. And this is what we see over and over again. I just want to give one more example that I think is truly remarkable in that regard, and that is the power of assassination that I just talked about that President Obama has claimed. If you think about the controversies that took place in the United States only 4 or 5 years ago under President Bush, and the things that made progressives and Democrats and lots of other people run around screaming that our Constitution was under attack, it was being shredded, and our values were being stumbled upon, and there was a war on American values, those controversies involved things like President Bush asserting the power to detain people without charges or due process, or to eavesdrop on the conversations and emails of American citizens without judicial review, without first going to a court and getting a court's permission. And this was wildly controversial, considered truly radical, created lots of political controversy. And yet now here we are 3 years later, and we have a Democratic president who is asserting the power not merely to detain people without charges, although that's still happening, and not merely to eavesdrop on our conversations without judicial review, although that too is still happening, but the power to kill us, to target us for assassination by CIA without a remote amount of due process or transparency. Not just a power claimed in theory, but a power exercised in reality when the CIA killed the American citizen Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen, and then 2 weeks later killed his 16-year-old American son Abdul Rahman with total secrecy, no transparency, and yet this produces almost no controversy because these extremist powers become very quickly normalized. This is the process of the United States over the last 10 years. I just want to share with you one anecdote about why I consider that to be the most odious part of all of this, the most disturbing of these distinguishing features. I gave a speech about 5 months ago in Indiana at Purdue University, and 3 high school students who write for their high school newspaper drove several hours to come hear my speech and to interview me afterwards. And I gave a speech about the abuses of civil liberties in the United States and the way in which these freedoms were under attack, and they came up to me afterwards and said they were there to interview me, but the things they actually said I think were more profound than anything I said to them, and certainly stuck with me to this day, because what they said was, look, you gave this speech about how the liberties in the United States have so radically eroded, how different things are pre-9/11 versus post-9/11, yet for people our age, they said, they are 15 and 16 years old, sophomores in high school, they said, we were 4 years old at the time of the 9/11 attack. And so for us, there really is no such thing in our political consciousness as this pre-9/11 world. The post-9/11 world is really all we know. For us, and for an increasing number of people who are coming of age in the post-9/11 world, what we think of as disturbing, what we think of as radical, what we think of as contrary to American values, is what they consider to be the normal state of affairs. And the more people who conceive of it that way, the harder it is going to be to uproot, and that too, I think, is one of the things that distinguishes these events from prior ones also. Now, one of the key themes I think to think about whenever you're thinking about these rights and these freedoms and how they're being eroded and how to defend them is the term civil liberties or civil freedoms. Because civil liberties is this term, and there are a lot of terms in our political discourse that are incredibly important that people don't think about what it means. We heard earlier Khalil talking about material support. It sends people to prison for decades, our fellow citizens, and yet almost nobody knows what it means. The terms terrorist, militant are incredibly important terms that have no real definition. I think civil liberties is a term that gets thrown around a lot, and yet very few people think about what it actually means. And the reason why it's worth thinking about is because it's not a very complex concept. All we really mean when we talk about civil liberties is the list of limitations that we have imposed on the government in terms of what they can do to us. It's really what the founders, when they formed the Republic, told themselves and the people who ratified the Republic that the government would never be able to do in order to prevent the tyranny that they had just fought to free themselves from. That's all that civil liberties are. They're just the list of limitations on government power. And this list of limitations is just as simple to understand because they're all set forth in a single document called the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. And these limitations are very clear and very absolute and are intended to be that. So you can look at the First Amendment and it says Congress shall make no law abridging free speech, and the Fourth Amendment says that we shall not be subjected to searches of our persons or papers or homes without a probable cause warrant, and the Fifth Amendment says that life or liberty shall never be deprived without due process of law. These are the limitations that we have systematically permitted the government to transgress. That's what we mean when we talk about a war on civil liberties. And the reason that that has happened, the main reason that we've allowed the government to do that is because the way in which civil liberties abuses almost always work historically is that when the government wants to legitimize abuses of power, they single out what they perceive to be the most vulnerable and the most marginalized group in the society because they believe, usually accurately, that the majority of people won't object when those people's rights are eroded and targeted. And the reason why that's such a dangerous thing to allow to happen, aside from the gross immorality of thinking that you're only going to care about injustices if they directly affect you, is because abuses of power always expand beyond their original application. They never stay confined to the original group that it is justified when applied to. And the problem with it is that once you allow government abuses to be legitimized when applied to a marginalized group on the grounds that they deserve it or that you don't care because it doesn't affect you, by then it's too late to fight it because courts have accepted it and it becomes an entrenched part of our political life. And you see this over and over. If you look at how the Patriot Act has been used since 2001, that was justified in the name of terrorism, overwhelmingly it's been applied to cases having nothing to do with terrorism. Or if you look at the preemptive prosecutions that Steve talked about, and the way in which the FBI creates plots and tricks people into joining them and manipulates them so they can prosecute them, that's now happening far beyond the Muslim community. It's happening to the Occupy movement, to anarchists, to NATO protesters in Chicago. These techniques, once we allow them to take hold, always end up being applied in ways that we don't anticipate. And it's this danger that I think more than any other needs to be highlighted so that more and more people start objecting to these abuses, even if they perceive that in most cases it's being applied to a group that is not them. Now, the last point I want to make is I just want to talk about the implications of allowing government to transgress these limits, to violate our civil liberties in these ways. And there are lots of different disturbing implications that are sort of obvious. If you don't have free speech rights to be prosecuted, then the ability that we have to challenge and deter government policy and action is severely lessened. If we let the government invade our conversations without proving that there's a cause to do so, our right to privacy and everything that it provides is essentially abolished. But there's one implication that I think is more significant than that, that's much more pernicious, and again, a little bit difficult to think about, but I think worth taking a little bit of time to do so. And to me, the most significant implication of allowing the government to transgress these limitations that we've imposed on them is that it radically changes, it fundamentally changes the relationship between us as citizens and the government. And what I mean by that is that in general, in a free society, in an ideal world, the people who exercise power will have fear of the people over whom they're exercising that power. They will fear the consequences of what will happen if they abuse their power. They will look to historical examples or contemporary examples where tyrants and rulers who abused power ended up provoking backlash and punishment by the people whose rights they were abusing. That's the ideal situation. That's when you have freedom, is when the people who wield power fear the people over whom they're exercising power. That's what keeps them in check and deters abuses. What we have in the United States in the post 9/11 world is the exact opposite dynamic. It's the hallmark of tyranny. The hallmark of tyranny is that the citizenry fears the people who are exercising power and does not believe that they can force adherence to those limitations. A climate of fear gets created when the government makes clear that they can no longer be held to these limitations, that they can essentially do anything that they want. And I just want to share one anecdote quickly to convey to you exactly what made me realize that this is the situation prevailing in the United States in a very vivid and personal way. It took place in January of 2010, which is the first time that I ever wrote about the organization WikiLeaks. I've written about them a lot since then, but this is the first time I had ever written about them. And in January of 2010, almost nobody had heard of WikiLeaks. It was before they had engineered any of their very large news-making leaks, like the video of the Apache helicopter in the United States, in Baghdad, killing unarmed journalists and civilians. It was an organization that was really not known to very many people, including me. And the way that I had come to learn about WikiLeaks was that the Pentagon in 2008 had prepared a top-secret report. And this top-secret report declared WikiLeaks formally to be what the report called an enemy of the state. It said that WikiLeaks was a profound threat to the national security of the United States, and the report plotted ways that the Pentagon could destroy WikiLeaks. It was a top-secret report. And ironically enough, in 2010, somebody leaked that report to WikiLeaks, which then published it online. And the New York Times noticed this, or was alerted to it somehow, and they wrote a very short article. Nobody knew who this group was, but it talked about how this weird, small transparency group had just been declared in secret by the Pentagon to be an enemy of the state, and they were dedicated to thinking about ways to destroy it. And I remember at the time, my immediate reaction was, well, any group that has been declared by the Pentagon to be an enemy of the state is one that merits a lot more attention and probably a lot of support. And so I went and I did a bunch of research about WikiLeaks, and I saw that they had engineered a bunch of important leaks in small, localized places. They had exposed corporate waste and toxic dumping in East Africa, and some deceit and corruption in some towns in Australia and some lying on the part of city officials in Berlin over a fire. And I really was moved by the model that they seemed to be creating and saw the promise and value of this organization. So I wrote a long article about them. I interviewed the group's founder, Julian Assange, and I posted that audio interview. And at the end of this article, I encouraged people to donate money to the organization because I knew they were sitting on lots of important secrets, they didn't have enough staff, and they were suffering financial constraints. And I thought their work was important enough that I encouraged people to donate. And I provided a link to how people could wire money electronically and donate money by PayPal. And in response to my writing that article and encouraging people to donate, I had dozens and dozens of people, literally dozens and dozens, in all different venues, in the comment section to the article I had written, by email, at events like this, come up to me and say basically along the lines of, look, I agree with you completely about the promise WikiLeaks holds and the reasons why it's so important that we support this organization. The problem that I have, though, is that I'm actually afraid that if I donate money to this group, that I will end up on some government list somewhere. Or even worse, that at some point I could be subjected to criminal liability for materially supporting a terrorist organization if the government so decrees that. These were not people who were prone to conspiracy theories. I know how to recognize those from talking to a lot of those people. These were very sober, rational people who really had this fear. And what was so striking to me about that was that these were American citizens who had been intimidated, really bullied, out of exercising their own core constitutional rights, which is what donating money to an organization whose political cause you support is. It's a pure First Amendment right of free speech and free association. They were afraid to exercise this right. And what was so striking about it to me was that you can offer and guarantee all the rights you want on a piece of paper or a piece of parchment. And yet, if you sufficiently intimidate the citizenry out of exercising those rights become completely meaningless. A climate of fear renders those rights worthless. I had a similar experience a few months later. I had written about the detention, the very oppressive detention of the 23-year-old Army private who was accused of being one of the prime leakers to WikiLeaks, Bradley Manning. They were holding him in prolonged solitary confinement for months on end under conditions designed to make him basically go insane. And I remember people be asking me when I wrote about this article, and I remember thinking to myself, why would the government want to detain Bradley Manning in these oppressive conditions? It seems to be contrary to their interest. It turned him into a martyr. It meant that statements that they got from him could be excluded from trial on the grounds that had been coerced. It created a little mini scandal when Obama's own chief spokesman of the State Department, P.J. Crowley, denounced the treatment and resigned in protest. And it was hard to see why they would do this, why they perceived this to be in their interest. And at some point after thinking about that, what I realized is that the reason that they put Bradley Manning into extreme solitary confinement designed to drive him insane is the same reason that they sought to make everyone afraid of supporting WikiLeaks and threatening to prosecute WikiLeaks. And it's the same reason that the US government abducted thousands of people from around the world and shipped them to the middle of the ocean and dressed them in orange jumpsuits and shackles and showed the world what they had done. The US government wants to send the signal. They want everyone to know that there are no limits on what it is that we can do to you. That if you seek to expose what we're doing in secret that's illegal or wrong, look at what we've done to Bradley Manning. If you think that you want to oppose the secrecy regime and what it is that we do around the world, look at how we've rendered WikiLeaks destroyed. If you want to oppose our foreign policy in any meaningful way and what we do in the world, look at what we did to people at Guantanamo who are still there and continue to die after a decade in a cage without charges of any kind. They want people to feel this climate of fear that comes from having you know that there are no longer any limits that they are afraid to cross, because that is what renders the citizenry pacified and frightened. And one of the things that has really affected me over the last 2 years as I go around to these events, and I speak in particular to people in Muslim communities in the United States, is just how effective this climate of fear has become. People in Muslim communities immediately think that if someone new at their mosque shows up, that they're likely sent by the FBI to deceive them or spy on them. They think that if they are on a telephone call or send an email, that the government is listening in or reading that email. They believe that if they express views on foreign policy critical of the United States, that could be used to justify prosecutions of them and to convince a jury that they wanted to do harm to the United States. The core rights that make America, America in theory, the right to free speech, the right to association, the right to privacy, are being systematically eroded, not by stormtroopers coming to arrest people for exercising them, but through intimidating people much more insidiously through this climate of fear. That is what all of these injustices and persecutions, more than anything else, are designed to accomplish. So the last thing I want to leave you with is, now that I've cheered you all up, is a little bit of thinking about what can be done about these problems. Because one of the dangers is that if you go to events like this and you sit and you listen to all these travesties and persecutions and injustices, it can just kind of make you drown in gloominess. Like you want to just leave here and say, God, I just listened to the most depressing thing. I just want to go hide under my covers or jump off a bridge or something. And I think it's important to think about the reasons why these injustices can be combated. Not in order to give people artificial optimism, but because the reality, the truth, is that it always is within our power to change any structures or institutions built by other human beings. And one of the things I think is very important to realize is that there is a great deal of sentiment in the United States that is truly opposed to the persecution of Muslim communities and the erosion of civil liberties in general. I see that with the response that my work generates. I also see it in lots of small but inspiring ways. A couple of weeks ago, or rather a month ago, in Joplin, Missouri, there was a mosque that had been the target of several arson attempts over the past several years that burned to the ground. And mosque leaders set a goal of raising $250,000 so they could rebuild their mosque, and anticipated that it would take a long time in order to raise that money. And I wrote about that project almost immediately after it happened. Several other people did as well. And within 24 hours, the $250,000 goal was widely exceeded. They raised almost $400,000. I think they've raised now close to $500,000, and they're not only going to rebuild their mosque, they're going to rebuild a much larger and more accommodating mosque that serves the people of the community in far better ways than they were ever able to do so before. And the large amounts of that money came from non-Muslims in the United States wanting to take a stand against the people who are targeted with these injustices and persecutions. But I think it's very important not to lose sight of just how pervasive that sense in the United States is. It needs to be better organized and better coordinated and better funded, which is one of the reasons why I'm so excited to be working with these two organizations who are sponsoring this event tonight. But it is out there, and it's a cause for optimism. And the other cause for optimism is the fact that when the country was founded and created, it was founded based on the recognition that there would always be severe injustice in the United States, and lots of institutions were created in order to provide checks on those, to remedy those injustices. One was a free press, one was free speech and the right to petition and assemble, another was the Congress, and one very important one was the courts, which were supposed to safeguard these rights. But no minority groups in the United States have ever been able to defend their rights by waiting around and hoping that they're given. They've only been able to do that by forming coalitions and fighting and taking it. And it's extremely important that those of us who want to do something about these things that we're talking tonight, that we don't just mentally oppose them, we don't just talk about the ways in which they need to be combated. We do what we can, using our resources, our time, our energy, our volunteer work, and our money to enable coordination and organization to fight these injustices. And there are lots of groups in the United States that I consider to do great work, but it really is true that the Muslim Legal Fund and the National Coalition are in places where nobody else is. The goal of the United States government is to make you forget that these people on this wall even exist. That's why they're put away in solitary confinement for decades, so you forget they exist. They are working not just to prevent us from forgetting, but also to ensure that their rights are protected in ways that nobody else would be doing in the absence of their work. And so we're nearing the end of our program, with the exception that we're going to hear from Osama in just a minute, who's going to talk about ways that you can support this organization. And I really encourage you to stay to the end of what he has to say and to listen to it with an open mind and to think about you're doing what you can to support these groups whose work I've really come to know intimately over the past year and to be really inspired by and to be so happy to support and be a part of in any way I can. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to him, and I thank you very much for coming tonight and listening.
The first thing that has been asked by a lot of people is basically of a political nature. Who should we vote for, or who do you think that we will go further backwards in the erosion of civil liberties if a Republican is elected, or what are the dangers of civil liberties if a Republican was elected, and if we believe that it's not Obama that is imposing the drone attacks, but it's the State Department that is doing this. Can you comment on that? So basically on a political nature, what advice would you give our audience tonight?
That's for me. I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, so this is a question that I get asked a lot, and I haven't formulated some definitive decree about who I think should be voted for, in part because I think it's pompous, and in part because I don't think that I want to attach myself to any particular electoral outcome, because I don't actually think that any of the issues that we're talking about tonight will be significantly affected one way or the other based upon the outcome of the election. By which I mean that I think that if we're going to meaningfully combat the trends and injustices that we've talked about tonight, that is going to take much, much more than simply going to the ballot box once every 4 years and choosing between one of the two political parties, which I think will have a marginal impact at best on these issues. So I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that. I think that one of the things I try and do is shed light on these issues, and then leave it to other people to decide how those things should be weighed. If you're in a state where the outcome is in question, which would exclude the state that we're currently in, then that might mean that you would think differently about how you're going to vote and what the meaning of your vote is, whether you will vote, whether you'll vote for a third party or for one of the two candidates than if we were in a different state. That said, I think there's an assumption that as horrible and heinous as Obama has been on these issues, and he has been both horrible and heinous, that automatically, just inherently, it's true that the Republican candidate would be worse. And there's a case to be made for that. I mean, if you look at the things that Romney says about Obama in these areas, he actually isn't saying that Obama has gone too far in use of aggression and violence or in lawlessness or abridging civil liberties. He actually says, I don't think he's gone far enough. I think he should be even more extreme. And so there's a tendency to say, well, if the Republicans got into office, that would actually make things worse. And there's an argument you can make for that. But I actually think that there's another argument to make that would suggest the opposite is true, which is that Democratic presidents and politicians in general feel compelled to show what they call strong they are, which means killing lots of people, abusing lots of legal protections, ignoring the Constitution in ways that Republicans might not. I was on a panel a couple months ago with someone from the ACLU, and he was asked, from the ACLU's perspective, does the election outcome matter? And he said there's actually, in his mind, a significant chance that had McCain won instead of Obama, that by now Guantanamo would be closed, because McCain would not have felt the need to avoid these issues, that he could have brought the Republican Party with him, along with his desire to close Guantanamo. For me, when I think about these issues, I almost never think about the election outcome and how that will impact what we're talking about, because that is not the path to changing this or much else. I think about ways to change public opinion, ways to join with my fellow citizens to combat these things, ways to create organizations that can exert power and influence in the society in a way that will change them. So I don't write much about the election. I don't think much about the election. To be totally honest, I don't care much about the election. That doesn't mean that I think the outcome is irrelevant or that you shouldn't vote. It just means that I think that on the list of things that will affect what we're talking about tonight, the election is very close to the bottom.
The next question are kind of a grouped question is, why does there seem to be apathy and disregard for the disappearance of civil liberties, especially among the second and third generation Americans? And is the media, has it been complicit with the promoting the abuses that we've talked about tonight? Is the media one big entity with many facets, or can you please comment?
So, I mean, one of the issues I think that it answers that is what I talked about a little bit earlier, which is there's a pretty brilliant strategy for governments that want to abuse rights, which is that they are very good at smelling vulnerability. So they almost always begin by targeting those groups that are the least able to defend themselves. It's sort of the same as the United States foreign policy. The United States government loves to start wars with countries that can't fight back. It doesn't like very much to start ones with countries that can. It's sort of the same with civil liberties abuses. They target those groups that are least able to exert power in the society. Because what ends up happening is two things. Number one is lots and lots of people think that because it's only happening to that group, either it's irrelevant to their lives because they're not being swept up in it, or even worse, that that group probably deserves it. And what ends up happening then is that those abuses become legitimized, they become institutionalized. So once you win the right to imprison Muslims for expressing political views, you win the right to imprison anybody for doing that. Once you win the right to eavesdrop on the telephone conversation of American Muslims without going to a court, you win the right to eavesdrop on the telephone conversations of everybody without doing that. And that, to me, is the most important mandate of people who believe in civil liberties and freedoms, is to make clear that freedoms are universal. And that when they're a bridge for any one group, they're a bridge for everybody. Not because of some cliched view that we're all connected in some kind of new age way, but because just as a matter of historical reality, allowing those abuses to take hold for anybody is to allow them to take hold for everybody. That's been proven over and over. As far as the American media is concerned, of course, the American media not only ignores these issues, but does what it can to justify them. The purpose of the American media in the United States is to not support the Democrats or support the Republicans, but to bolster and justify whatever political power in the United States does. That's their prime function. You wind them up, and that's what they do. And one of the reasons why I am optimistic about lots of the things we're talking tonight, besides what I ended by talking about, is because the internet has really undermined the stranglehold that the American media has on our political discourse. So if 10 years ago you wanted to reach a large audience, you had to go work for one of the large media corporations in the United States and accept all the limitations that it imposes on what you could talk about, how you could talk about, who you can criticize. Now, if you want to find a large audience, you can do so completely independently, as I've been able to do, as lots of other people have been able to do. And it also means that we don't just hear a very limited range of opinion. It's just as easy to click onto the New York Times as it is to click onto a newspaper in the Muslim world, or in any other part of the world, or in any part of the political spectrum, and expose ourselves to a very wide range of political opinions. It's really democratized political discourse. It's enabled us to join together and to connect with other people who are like-minded in ways that even 10 years ago didn't exist before. And that's really rendered what the media does or doesn't do much less important than it was even very recently. And that, I think, is a genuine cause for optimism, and we need to think more about how to exploit that technology to allow it to fulfill those ends even more.
As a follow-up question, has there been any progress since 2001 regarding civil liberties, or has it all just gotten worse?
Yeah, so it's all about worse. Yeah, you know, I mean, it's weird. I mean, the temptation is to say that, you know, people have become less hysterical about the terror threat after 11 years. That would be the intuitive thing that you would think would happen. And yet it really hasn't happened. I mean, you can point to certain things. Defenders of President Obama like to herald the fact that he banned torture and ordered the CIA black sites to be closed. But the reality is the time that he was inaugurated and he banned those torture techniques, the authorization for those techniques had already been withdrawn for at least 16 months. And the CIA black sites that he so heroically ordered closed had already been emptied out 2 years earlier when all the inmates were transferred to Guantanamo. So even the sort of success stories that you could point to are really just purely symbolic gestures, empty, ways to signal to people that some progress is being made, which is really not giving up any power. What has really happened is that we've become so conditioned to accepting any assertion of power in the name of terrorism that it doesn't even matter anymore what that power is or how radical it is. It induces almost complete indifference and apathy, if not overt support. And the thing that I actually think is the most disturbing in this regard is that I know just from my own personal experience, if 4 years ago I went somewhere and I spoke about these issues and condemned these civil liberties abuses and these policies, 50% of the room would be very angry about the things I was saying and think it was outrageous and I was some sort of radical. Those were called Republicans. But 50% of the room would be cheering boisterously and telling me how great it was that I was defending all the things that are so important, and those were called Democrats. But now, 4 years later, if I give that same exact speech to that same exact room, 90% of the room is going to hate me. Maybe 85% if I'm lucky, and 10 to 15% are going to be supportive, because what the legacy of President Obama has been to take these policies and this mindset that just a few years ago were sort of the symbol of right-wing radicalism of George Bush and Dick Cheney Republicanism, and converted them into bipartisan consensus. So that now these policies and this mindset are not just the province of one party, but of both parties jointly, and has brought a lot of people who just a few years ago were claiming to be civil liberties advocates and defenders of these kind of principles, and converted them into supporters of them, of these policies. And that has really changed the way the populace thinks about it. It's changed the political landscape. It's made the work of those of us who are fighting for these issues that much harder. And that's the real reason for regression, is that President Obama has had a real effect on the Democratic Party and turning lots of people into supporters of these policies who very recently were opponents of them. And that, I think, has made the process accelerate even more.
4 or 5, 6 years ago, when we first got started with this, I'm trying to find something that I can disagree with on what we just said, because I would like to be able to say something positive, although I agree completely with what Glenn said. But 4 or 5, 6 years ago, when we got started on this, we were dealing with isolated cases all over the country in which people were really upset about people having been convicted and sentenced and sent away to jail, but they didn't know why. They didn't understand what the government was doing. And in this time, what we've tried to do is develop an analysis of preemptive prosecution and what the government is doing and the motives behind it, so that now when people are able to talk about it, people that have cases can come up to each other and actually have language with which to describe what happened to them. And in doing that, we've been able to unite all of these cases together and be able to talk about it. So I'm absolutely 100% confident that a day will come when Americans will look back on this and will be able to link all these cases. These were not isolated terrorist cases, but cases of things that happened because the government wanted them to be happening. Does that mean things are getting better? No, I don't think they're getting better. I think they're getting worse. But someday, we have the language there, we have the analysis there, someday people will look back and recognize what we did, and that what we did was similar to what we did to the communists and to the Japanese and to a long list of other people in the past. And that's the one thing that I see that is hopeful.
I have a couple of just quick ones here that I can answer. Why isn't the ACLU in the NCPCF coalition? One is the ACLU joins no coalition, so they don't become members of anything. They stand alone. But we're working with the ACLU on many cases. They're actively involved in this issue. They're in the Irvine 11 case and freedom of speech and the CMU issues that are going on in the detention of prisoners. So they are very active. They are very supportive. We work with them on a daily basis, but they don't join.
What is CMU?
Oh, CMU is a communication management unit. A CMU is a special prison that says, okay, here's the Federal Bureau of Prisons, here's how a normal prisoner is to be taken care of, here's all the rules, here's how you can visit them, here's how you can write them, here's how they can communicate. These are the rules of a federal prison. They have created a new type of prison called a CMU. It's a federal prison with the same rules, but increased measures to discourage communication. In other words, to let them talk to their family less, to talk to the outside world less, to have no ability to to visit, to see people, and it's called a CMU. And there's one in Terre Haute, Indiana, there's one in Marion, Illinois, they have a CMU in the Supermax in Denver, Colorado, or I don't know where in Colorado it is. Florence, Colorado. And these communication management units are primarily full of Muslim inmates, where they don't want them talking about anything to anybody about any of it, and including their family, including business, including personal conversation, and any communication with the outside world. And these CMUs are what we're saying are unconstitutional, created specifically just to discredit and to marginalize these inmates, and that the ACLU, the Center for Constitutional Rights, the Bill of Rights Defense Committee, the Muslim Legal Fund, and all the coalition members are trying to do something to change that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Those are easy. All right. I want to read this one. Recently, the organization in Iran called MEK was taken off the terrorist organization list. Please shed some light on this resurrection of the MEK, and is there a connection with Israel's drumbeats for war? Well, I don't want to go into that yet, but I forgot to read your question that was in relation to this first, and that was, how can you explain what it is exactly, how someone becomes a terrorist organization, and by legitimize a terrorist organization? When we said you can't do anything that further legitimizes a terrorist organization or terrorist activities, what is that we're talking about? And the person here is asking for more clarity, and so are we. That is the issue. The issue is, how do you determine what legitimizes a terrorist organization and furthers its cause? If I want to write a research paper on terrorists and say, okay, I need to know how the mindset of somebody works and what's the profile of terrorists and how do we protect ourselves from terrorism, and I go talk to terrorists to find out that profile and learn their background and learn about their family, and I do this research paper, and I say this is how we can better improve our efforts against terrorism, then the work itself is legitimizing a terrorist, institutionalizing, you can take that to be as vague as you want it to be. So that is the problem, is that nobody can define exactly what legitimizing a terrorist organization is. All it takes for the US government to put somebody on the terrorist list, in other words, there's two lists, one at the State Department and one at the Treasury Department. And those two lists are maintained, and it's supposed to give all of us guidance as to who we can deal with. So if they're a designated terrorist or a terrorist organization, these rules are in effect, so you as a citizen of the United States don't get near it. But for them to put somebody on that list is what's called the threshold in the judicial system of just cause. Just cause is the lowest threshold. The highest threshold is beyond a reasonable doubt. So any of these people that are on this wall tonight, a jury had to convict them from the highest standard of proof, which is beyond a reasonable doubt. Then there's a lower burden of proof that says, okay, preponderance of evidence. And then the next one is something else. And then the next one. And it goes all the way down to the lowest threshold for something to be a judicial decision is just cause. And that's what the government has to meet the threshold of to put somebody on a terrorist organization or an organization on a watch list. Just cause. Just any good reason. Do you want to come on?
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting question because terrorism is probably the most useless term ever invented. It sheds no clarity or analysis. It simply condemns mindlessly. And there are conflicts all over the world. Various people are fighting each other for control of a particular area. And what we tend to do as a political decision is to pick out the people who are on our side, and we say those are the freedom fighters. And we pick out the people that are on the other side, and we say those are the terrorists. So that the designation to put somebody on the list is really a political decision that we make based on who we want to support. It has nothing to do with the level of violence that the freedom fighters have or the terrorists have. And I think the MEK is a wonderful example of that. This was a group in Iran that was quite violent and was causing a lot of problems, but they tended to spend a lot of time causing problems for the Iranian government. They were put on the designated terrorist list because they had caused violence. But various people in the United States began to say, well, wait a minute, if they're causing problems for the Iranian government, why don't we support them? Why don't we take them off? In other words, the whole point of this thing is not whether they're a terrorist organization or they're not a terrorist organization, that the term is meaningless. The question is, are they our allies or are they not our allies? And so this group began to go to America and pay money to get people, high-ranking government officials, to support their cause to get them off of the list. And this was astonishing, because to take money from a terrorist organization and then to go and advocate on their behalf to the US government was the classic material support for terrorism. All of these high-ranking officers were clearly violating what any other person would have done, would have ended up in jail with. Did we do anything about it? Of course not. We took them off the list because it's a political decision. It has nothing to do with with whether they're violent or they're not violent. And this is something that is very important to understand.
Yeah, let me just add one thing about that MEK example. I've written a lot about that, and it is just extraordinary for all the reasons Steve said. It really shows just how kind of rotted and corrupt this concept is. But I remember I wrote about one of the people who were taking money from the MEK were all kinds of well-known, influential people in Washington from both political parties, like Howard Dean and Ed Rendell and Rudy Giuliani and Tom Ridge and a whole bunch of them. Yeah, lots of them. Right, and well, one of the people was Fran Townsend, who was George Bush's Homeland Security advisor and now is a national security commentator or analyst or whatever she's called for CNN. And what was really amazing was I wrote once about Fran Townsend, and I sort of just held her up as, I think the headline was Fran Townsend terrorist supporter or something, because she was taking money from the MEK and then going around and meeting with their leaders and advocating for them based on coordinated messaging. And she was asked about it in all kinds of venues, and what she said was, she was very offended, and she said, "How dare anybody suggest that I'm doing anything improper? I have the First Amendment right to go and advocate on behalf of this group," which I actually agree with. I think she does. The problem is that in 2010, the Supreme Court, in the humanitarian law case versus Holder, said, and it adopted the Obama administration's position, and it said that even pure political advocacy on behalf of a terrorist organization, if it is coordinated with that group, can be deemed material support. So even if you're just expressing your pure political opinion, that can now be criminalized as material support, said the Supreme Court, if you coordinated with that group. And lots of people have been prosecuted under this theory. That is the theory that led to the indictment of this 22-year-old Muslim student for uploading this YouTube video critical of U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. government said they found an email where he had communicated a month earlier with the son of a terrorist leader, and that showed that he was coordinating his YouTube video and his pro-terrorist organization messaging sufficient to make that material support. And what was most amazing to me about Fran Townsend's indignation that anyone would suggest that she was doing something wrong when all she was doing was exercising her free speech right was I found this segment that CNN did on the humanitarian law case when it was released, and they invited their national security expert, Fran Townsend, on to talk about this case, and she lavishly praised the Supreme Court and the Obama administration. She said it is crucial that we be able to criminalize the advocacy on behalf of terrorist organizations, because she thought, and Rudy Giuliani, who supported that decision, thought that this would only be used to criminalize and indict and imprison Muslims. And then once it came time to look at their own conduct under the same theory and the same statute, then it suddenly became outrageous in their eyes that their constitutional rights would be jeopardized, because for them, Muslims are not people who can invoke constitutional rights, even if they're American citizens, as many of these people who have been prosecuted under this theory have been. And the fact that you have dozens of Muslims serving decades in prison for far fewer contacts with terrorist organizations than Howard Dean and Ed Rendell and all of these other officials have with the MEK, and have been taking lots of money from them, tens of thousands of dollars, meeting with their leaders, advocating on their behalf, and yet the idea that they would ever be prosecuted was inconceivable. You knew that once Republicans and Democrats in Washington began advocating for their behalf, that it was inevitable that they would be taken off the list and there'd be no accountability. That really shows just how perverted this concept of terrorism is, but also how completely
warped and distorted the law is. It is a weapon used to criminalize the constitutional rights, largely of Muslims, but also of anyone who opposes U.S. government policy in any meaningful way, and that's what I think makes it so disturbing.
Thank you.
With that, I think that will conclude our program tonight. If you have other questions, feel free to just come on up, but we'll dismiss the program and conclude by saying thank you for coming out tonight. We hope you appreciated the program. We hope that you tell others about what you learned tonight, and please take all the literature and all of the marketing material that we gave you so that you will remember some of this and be ways to get in touch with us. Sign up for the civilfreedoms.org website, newsletter, sign up for the Muslim Legal Fund newsletter so we can keep everybody posted on the work that we're doing. So thank you all for coming, and good night.
Thank you all.